Welcome to the Ronel Talks Money Show. Today we are going to talk about credit reports or credit record as well as credit scores. But before we start, I just want to remind you, please subscribe to the channel. Go to the link at the bottom where you will see we have a monthly giveaway competition and where you can win one of my books, Financially Fit and Wealthy, as well as various other finance-related tools and resources to help you. Now, today we have Thinus Nortje with us, who will talk to us more about credit reports and credit scores. And Thinus is the CEO of Very Credit Bureau since 2005. So he's very knowledgeable about this topic, and I do believe it's a very relevant topic at the moment. So Thinus, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Ronel. It's good to be with you guys, and I hope the viewers enjoy what we are talking about today.
No, I'm sure they will. Thinus, maybe you can just briefly tell us a little bit more about Very Credit, like what are you guys doing?
So we are a registered payment profile hosting credit bureau with the National Credit Regulator, and there's actually a couple of different types of credit bureaus in South Africa. We are what they call a hosting bureau. Then you also have reseller bureaus, which resells information from hosting bureaus. And then you've got credit bureaus that focuses more on niche markets like rentals, etc. But Very Credit Bureau, as a hosting credit bureau, essentially we host and have all the payment and financial and personal information of all the credit active consumers in South Africa. So all the credit providers in South Africa, the insurance companies, the telcos would submit data to us, and we would then make that data available to credit providers, for example, to insurance companies, anybody that wants to make a risk-based decision on whether they should grant somebody a home loan or vehicle finance. They would inquire from us and then access a person's consumer profile or their payment history to see if there's any risk involved with giving that person a loan or vehicle finance, for example. So we host quite a comprehensive data set on all the credit active consumers and credit active consumers in South Africa, and make that available to businesses to make decisions.
Okay. And then you should maybe also just explain to us in layman's terms, just the credit record and credit score. What is it all about?
Yeah, so it's quite complex, as you mentioned, but in layman's terms, your credit record will essentially tell a credit provider, like a bank or a retailer, how you pay your accounts. So all your accounts would be listed there, your credit card, your home loan, your vehicle finance, and it will contain the full history. So it will tell whoever's accessing your account that you paid the last 12 months or you missed a payment somewhere. It will also, for example, contain information like maybe judgments that have been listed or granted against you, which will show on your profile as well. So if you've defaulted, it will show on your profile as well. So it gives a very detailed history on how you are paying your accounts. In other words, what is your behavior when it comes to payment of accounts? Your score is different in the sense that your score is basically a very quick view for the credit provider to determine what sort of risk is involved with yourself. So when you apply for a loan or a home loan, so the credit record will be much more detailed, but the score would be just one score that tells the credit provider or the insurance company or whoever's inquiring what is the type of risk profile that you fit into.
Okay, and then for consumers now, if they go and they pull the credit report maybe for the first time, you've mentioned now a couple of the items, but what does it typically reflect, or what is the information that they will typically see on that credit report?
So not one credit report from all the bureaus are exactly the same. There's different ways in which they reflect the information, but essentially it will contain the personal information that the credit bureau have on record for that consumer. So it will tell you what is the telephone number that we have available for you, the addresses that we have for you, your personal information, so your names and your surnames. It will have that information available, your basic contact and personal information. And then it could be different from bureau to bureau, but essentially what it will then also have, it will have all your accounts listed, and it will show the installment amounts, for example, on your retail account. It will show what's outstanding. It will show when was the last payment, for example. It will show what the status is of your account. So status could be that you haven't paid. If there's no status, it means that's good, because that means you're active and you're paying. But it could have an adverse status, which means you are not paying, or you may be in arrears with a month or so. And then it will move over into a more detailed breakdown of those accounts specifically. So it will look at every individual account. So your retail account will look at specifically, and it will show a history. It will be either 12 months or 24 months, or sometimes even 36 months back, to see how you've paid your account, how you've paid that specific account, how you've behaved, in other words. And that will then in turn, be used by the credit providers to make a decision based on how you pay your accounts. It will also then, in many instances, show properties that you own. It will also show if you've not paid your accounts. It will also show, for example, if you're under debt review. So if your debts have been restructured, there will be a debt review status that is reflected on your credit profile. It will also show judgment information. So there's information around judgments that's been granted to you by either a high court or a magistrate court that will reflect on your credit record. And it will also show, instances where you've been handed over to debt collectors, for example. That's everything that will show on your credit report. Some credit reports are a bit more detailed, so it could show things like company information. So if you're involved in a company as either a director or a business owner, or you're a member of a closed corporation, that could also reflect on your credit report.
Okay.
So it's very detailed.
I know, so sometimes it can happen, and it has happened to me, that you would go to the doctor, for example, and you think you've paid everything, and then 6 months later, there's somebody calling you and say, okay, you haven't paid for this blood test or something, and you haven't even been aware of it. Would
Yes.
the credit report typically reflect items like this as well?
So not always is the short answer. Just to take the viewers back a little bit, the credit profile focuses primarily on credit based information, so credit cards, retail accounts, vehicle finance, home loans, those type of accounts. But we also do have all the large insurers in South Africa, all the large mobile companies in South Africa, and the like, submitting information to the credit bureaus. But the doctors, for example, and schools, for example, are not obligated to submit this information to credit bureaus. But what they do is, let's say, for instance, that you do owe a doctor some money. After a certain amount of time has elapsed and they've not been able to collect that money from you, they can list you as a default payer with any of the 5 primary bureaus. Now, obviously, there's a process in terms of compliance that they need to follow. So they need to give you at least 28 business days notice that they're going to list you with a credit bureau. But once that 28 days have elapsed, they can list you with either of the 5 primary bureaus, but they don't have to list you with all 5 primary bureaus. They can list you with any one of the 5. So your doctors may decide to list you with one bureau, and that information will only reflect at that bureau. So if a credit provider uses that bureau as their primary bureau to do inquiries, they will also see that you don't pay your doctor's account, that you haven't paid the school fees, etc. So it's not information that's compulsory to be reflected at bureaus, but it does reflect at some bureaus, dependent on whether the doctor or the school or that institution wants to list you as a default payer with that bureau.
Okay, and then what about, I know that if you are a property investor and you want to screen tenants for basically having a poor record in terms of paying their rental, what about that with something where they are not paying the rent? Would that reflect on a credit record?
So once again, it's very much the same principle as I've just explained. It depends on that rental agency on whether they want to list you as a default payer, and once again, they can decide which primary bureau they want to use to do that. But there is, if I can take you back right to the beginning when I mentioned, the different type of bureaus that you get, there are bureaus that specializes in the rental market. So there's a bureau by the name of Tenant Profile Network. They, for example, specifically focus on the rental market. So anybody that wants to do some sort of vetting on a potential tenant can go and inquire with Tenant Profile Network because they have all the information on how people are paying their rental. But it's not information that's traditionally submitted as part of the compulsory legislative process to the primary bureaus.
Okay, now that's very good to understand that. Then
Yes.
In terms of your credit score, what are the factors that would typically determine your credit score, or how is it calculated?
I'm not going to bore the viewers with too much detail around that because it is actually a very complex process, and we have people that we call data scientists that actually go and that build these models for us. Very clever people, but it looks at a number of factors. It's very difficult to just give you, the exact detail, but it looks, for example, at things like how you behave, like I've mentioned previously. Are you paying your accounts or are you not paying your accounts? How many accounts you have can have an effect. How regularly you apply for credit can have an effect. So every credit report also will reflect every inquiry that's done on your report. So every time somebody accesses your profile, like a bank or a retailer, it will show the bank XYZ looked at your profile. It's only when you look at your own account, your own profile, that it doesn't reflect there. But every other inquiry will reflect there. If I want to actually urge viewers to look at their reports, and if there's an inquiry that's been made there without their consent, they should actually query that with that bureau. But it looks at inquiries. So how often do you apply for credit? How much credit do you have? It looks at your credit limits, for example. So it looks at how you use your credit limit. So if your credit limit is to the maximum every single month, that will have an effect on your credit score as well. Now, it's a bit of a catch-22 situation sometimes when it comes to a credit score, because we need a lot of data to build those sort of models and to give someone a score. Sometimes, the good guys who actually don't have a lot of credits, it's difficult to build a score for them because they don't have a lot of data. We call them thin file clients. It's a bit of a catch-22 situation. But those are some of the things, that are taken into account when we're looking at scores of consumers.
Okay. And then what would be considered a good credit score or a poor credit score?
So the scores are normally broken into different risk bands. So it's not the same across all the different bureaus. It can differ completely from one bureau to another, but it should be more or less aligned. But to put it, I'm not going to use any numbers, but to just put it this way, I would say that anything from a medium to low risk, would be something that a credit provider would look at as a good score. Anything from a medium to a high risk would be something that a credit provider deems a bad score. But I do want to say this: it doesn't really. There's no such thing as a good or a bad score. it really comes down to what the credit provider determines to be their risk appetite. So you may have credit providers that are looking at different features when it comes to a consumer, and the score doesn't mean much to them. So it's actually very difficult to group that, because it depends on the risk policy of the specific credit provider in terms of who they want to take a risk on. But I would say, low risk, obviously, very low risk is your probably your best score, and then a very high risk would not be a good score.
Okay, and then what would the credit scores typically be used for?
So there's a couple of ways that credit providers use it, and once again, it depends on their own business rules and own models. Sometimes a score is used just to pre-vet a consumer. So somebody's just applying, for a loan, and they want to see if they qualify. A credit provider could use it in that instance just to quickly see if somebody will qualify, and they could have a score cutoff. So they could say anybody that's that's medium to high would unfortunately not qualify according to their risk policy. Anybody that's medium to very low would qualify, but then they would go into the normal National Credit Act affordability assessment process, where people would ask them for the income, expenses, all those sort of details to make sure that they comply in terms of what the Act requires. But it will be used to essentially determine the risk involved with doing business with you. So do I want to give you a loan, or do I not want to give you a loan? Because it's a behavioral score. It tells the credit provider at a quick glance, this is a risky consumer because they have not behaved well in the past, or no, this is a good consumer, they're behaving well, they're treating their accounts well, they're paying every single month, they don't have judgments against them, they're not under debt review, and it'll just give them a quick glance to make a decision on whether they actually want to do business with you or not.
Absolutely. And then you've mentioned now that your information can vary basically from credit bureau to credit bureau. So it is then kind of advisable to go and have a look at your credit reports, I assume, from all the credit bureaus, and check if there's not maybe something reflecting on the one that you disagree with.
Absolutely. I would encourage consumers to do that as much as possible. The Act currently allows you one free credit report per annum, so within a 12-month period. And I would use that opportunity to every year go and look at all my credit reports, what is reflected at all the primary bureaus, and to see that the information they have for me reflects correctly. It's very difficult for not difficult, but it's annoying when you actually want to apply for a home loan, or vehicle finance, specifically big asset items, and then to find out, oh my goodness, I've got an account that I've paid in 2018, but it still reflects at the primary bureau that my bank uses to do the inquiries. So I would, just from an accuracy point of view, just from an educational point of view, encourage people to go and look at the reports as much as possible. There are obviously payment options available as well. If you want to look at your credit report more frequently, then you obviously can inquire from the different bureaus, to pay for your credit report apart from the one that you get free every 12 months. But I would encourage people to regularly go and check their credit reports.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. And then if you now obtain your credit report and you see something on there that you disagree with, what is the process that you should follow?
So every bureau will have a dispute process, which is prescribed by legislation, by the National Credit Act, that we need to follow. So every consumer, when they find something that they don't agree with on their credit report, have a right to dispute that record that they don't agree with. They can lodge that dispute with the credit bureau specifically. If you go onto the website of all the primary bureaus, you will find a tab somewhere on there that takes you to a dispute page where you can lodge a dispute. The bureau that you lodge the dispute with may ask you for some supporting documentation to verify and support your dispute. They will then take that information and they will refer that to the specific credit provider. So let's say, for example, you have a credit card account that you're disputing with a specific bank. That bureau will then take that dispute and your information and the documentation, submit that to the specific bank and say, listen, this consumer has got a dispute. They're disputing this information. They're saying, let's say, for example, that they paid up the account in 2018 already. Here's the paid up letter. Now, we must understand that fraud obviously is prevalent. So an opportunity must be given to the credit provider and that institution that's involved to also investigate on their side whether this account has in fact been paid up. So once that's submitted to that institution to investigate, they have 20 business days to come back to us as a bureau and to the consumer, and us in turn to the consumer to resolve that dispute. The Act is very clear, Ronel, that if the institution at which the dispute has been submitted, if they don't come back to us within 20 business days, that the dispute must then resolve in favor of the consumer. So if they don't come back to us as a bureau within 20 business days, we must then, for example, mark that account as paid up as alleged by the consumer. But yeah, to answer you, a very structured, very good dispute process in place currently in South Africa to handle those sort of instances. I mean, all of us as primary bureaus do thousands of disputes on a yearly basis. And 100% correct. People must feel free and have the empowerment, to question any record that they don't agree with, but have the supporting documentation, obviously, to dispute, to back that dispute up.
Mm. And then what is the best way to obtain your credit report? Would you just go onto the different websites or?
Yes, so if I can briefly just mention all the payment profile or primary bureaus in South Africa, it would be ourselves, Very Credit Bureau, it would be TransUnion, it would be XDS, Consumer Profile Bureau, and then Experian. They can go onto the website of any of those primary bureaus, and there will be information available on how they can access the annual free credit report or then a subscription option where they can access their credit report more than once every 12 months. Ours is vccb.co.za, www.vccb.co.za, and they can go to the consumer tab where there's multiple options for the consumer. One of free credit report. They will then be taken to a consumer portal, and this is how it works with most of the bureaus, is there's an authentication and a validation process that then takes place to make sure that we are issuing this free credit report to the correct person. So they need to put in some information. We may need some documentation to verify the identity, proof of residence, before they can get the credit report. But that would be the best way is to access the websites for that information. They can also go to the Credit Bureau Association's webpage, which is the CBA, cba.co.za, and they can then go and see all the credit providers, credit bureaus information on the website there, and also some other educational material around how credit bureaus operate.
Okay. Now, I'm definitely going to share the website details so that the viewers can go and have a look. This is so important and such vital information that you need to know. And I think especially, like you mentioned, in terms of fraud as well. Yes. I mean, there could be something that's reflecting on your score that was because of a fraudulent activity and you are not even aware of it. And whenever you, like you said, you maybe want to acquire a loan or a bond or something, then only you get to know about it. And that's not the right time to hear about it for the first time. But then I also want to ask you, so who will typically have access to your credit information?
Access to credit information is very, very regulated. So the National Credit Regulator, the National Credit Act, is very strict around who can have access to credit information. So there's a reciprocal arrangement in place currently in terms of Regulation 1913 of the National Credit Act, which says that a person or an institution must submit data before they can get data. So if for example, you are an insurance agency and you want to have access to credit information, you must then also submit credit information to the bureaus to have access to that information. But there's many instances under which a person then has that kind of authorization to get access, can access a consumer's credit records. So firstly, they can have the consumer's consent to do that. So this would be in instances where you want to see if you qualify for a home loan or vehicle finance or retail accounts, then you can provide consent to that person to do that credit assessment or to look at your credit profile. Consumers must remember also, and the viewers must remember, that credit providers are by law obligated to do a credit assessment, an affordability assessment on you if you apply for credit. So they don't need your consent for an affordability assessment. But anybody else that wants to access your credit profile must have your consent to do so. That is very, very important for people to remember. So bottom line, and to answer you, is it's very regulated. It's not just open to anybody. We have very strict vetting processes in place to make sure that when we give people access to credit information, it's done so by law. They are properly registered with the National Credit Regulator as either a credit provider or they are registered as an insurance company. But we go through very strict vetting processes to make sure that we don't just give access to anybody.
Okay. No, I think that is very good to know, and it just gives you that sense of comfort that not just anybody will access your profile and your information. Thinus, then I think what is currently a reality in our daily lives, there are so many people who get retrenched, who have a reduction in their salaries, people's businesses or closing down or heavily impacted when it comes to income. So I think currently we are in a space where a lot of people will potentially default on certain payments. So what can you do if you know you are in that position where you no longer can afford all your bills and your installments to not negatively impact on your credit score?
Yeah, Ronel, I think you're 100% correct. Unfortunately, we live in a time where it's difficult for most consumers out there. If you look at the National Credit Regulator statistics that comes out every quarter, you'll find that almost 50% of South African consumers are either one or more months in arrears with one or more of their accounts. So people are finding it difficult to repay their debt and their credit. My advice always to people is that communicate with your credit providers. That's the bottom line. We find in so many instances that people, they get retrenched or they lose their job or they just don't have the money to pay, and then they just stay silent. They almost go into hiding and find it too embarrassed to speak to their credit providers. But I want to urge viewers and consumers out there to speak to your credit providers. You will find in 99.99% of the instances that your credit providers understand what you are going through. They actually have remedies and tools in place to assist you. They have processes and systems that can help you. They can extend your terms. They can maybe restructure your debt internally. So the most important advice I can give is go and speak to your credit provider. Unfortunately, if you can't repay your debt, or even if you are retrenched and you can only pay partially, it will reflect your credit profile in some way. One must remember now also that there are the credit providers out there that have not given credit to you, and during this retrenchment process, you find people that are trying to abuse the system and quickly apply for a loan while they are being retrenched, knowing that in 3 months' time, they're not going to be able to pay this loan, or even next month. And they then basically, in that process, defraud other credit providers. So that's why it's important that credit records reflect the true situation of what is happening in the consumer's life. But my advice is go and speak to your credit providers. All the credit providers, all the banks, all the retailers have some sort of a debt remediation process in place where they can assist you. And also, if you've been retrenched, see if you have some sort of a credit policy with your credit provider. It may be that you have a retrenchment policy in place where it takes care of your payments for a certain amount of time. But the bottom line is engage your credit provider, go and speak to them, tell them the real situation that you are facing, and you'll find probably most of the time that they are ready to able to assist you.
No, I totally agree with that. I think communication is just key. I mean,
yes.
You can definitely, I think, especially in this time, most credit providers will be rather willing to try and come to some sort of agreement to help you and assist you than to just lose out on receiving your payments at all. So I definitely think that is what people must do, go and talk to them, try to come to some kind of mutual agreement that can work for you. And I assume that if you have that kind of agreement in place, they would also not necessarily then kind of report you or give you kind of a bad credit score or something if they know they kind of have it under control.
Yeah, it depends what the arrangement is, but having that arrangement in place is much better than defaulting on a loan or your home loan, which would then immediately put you will immediately affect your risk score or reflect on your credit profile, or even have a judgment in place, which from a credit risk perspective carries a very high weighting. Once you have a judgment in place, I don't think there's many credit providers out there that will provide you and give you a loan. So that can put you back 3, 4, 5 years, in terms of then accessing credit once you again get a job. So bottom line is go and speak to your credit provider ASAP and get the situation sorted.
Okay. And then if you want to apply for a job, can a poor credit score impact on you or won't it?
It can definitely impact on you depending on what sort of a job that you are applying for. If you are applying for a job where you are involved in finances or handling of money or even security, employers look at your risk profile in those instances specifically. So if you have a poor profile or a poor payment profile and you're of a very high risk individual, it could affect your employment if you are in the finances industry or cash handling or even security industry. It could definitely have an impact. I know that those are the industries specifically that look at your score and your risk profile when you apply for a position with them, which is understandable. It's positions of trust, and you want to make sure that you're employing somebody that you can trust with the finances.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It definitely makes sense. I mean, you don't want to appoint somebody kind of managing your business's finances if they cannot manage their own finances.
Yes.
You can understand it from that point of view.
Yeah. And employers, important to remember, employers must get your consent to do that. Mm-hmm. So they must have your consent. If they want to check your profile for any sort of risk, they must have your consent to do so.
Okay, now that's important to know. Then what about if your partner is incurring a lot of debt or is mismanaging debt? Can it then impact on your credit score as well? Because you do hear a lot of horror stories about this out there.
Yeah, unfortunately, we have a dispensation in South Africa where people can be married in community of property. And what that means from a legal perspective is that basically, if I apply for a home loan, my wife is also liable Or people apply for joint home loans, for example, where they're married outside of community of property, but they're jointly responsible for the payment of that. So it can affect your credit score if your partner, for example, is not holding to their end of maybe a divorce settlement or some sort of an agreement. But once again, once that happens, and let's say, for example, you have a divorce settlement agreement in place which says that your ex-spouse is responsible to pay the bond on the property, you would need to dispute that record with the Bureau, submit the divorce settlement agreement, for example, and say the divorce order clearly says that my ex-spouse is liable to pay for the bond. It shouldn't be on my name, and then in that way rectify your record. But yeah, unfortunately, it can happen. So that's why, I'm not a divorce expert. I'm not a separation expert by no means. But that's why it's important when people do separate and there's joint loans or expenses involved, that people settle those, rather settle those debts, or make sure that they have whatever agreement happens between the parties are recorded in writing, so that you can prove when some sort of a dispute or non-payment arises that you are not responsible.
Mm. Yeah, no, and I think that is definitely, like I said, you hear a lot of horror stories. So,
Yes.
and that is again another reason why you should go and view your credit report, so that you become aware of these things. You don't want, you often hear that the one partner was not aware of what is happening. I mean, obviously, you can pick up these kind of things from a credit report.
Yeah, and I think, now people should take responsibility. They shouldn't just sit back and wait for the bank to do something, or expect that this ex-spouse is going to do something. They should take responsibility for their own finances and make sure that what was agreed is actually enforced. They should make sure that if the partner said, I'm going to speak to the bank, that they did speak to the bank. They should follow up with the bank. The banks are very large institutions. It can happen that something goes wrong there, or something is missed. And that's why it's important to always follow up and make sure that these things are in place. As I said, it's quite difficult to now, at the stage where you want to buy a property that may not be on the market forever, to find out that you don't qualify because there's an outstanding dispute. It's very difficult then to resolve those sort of issues at that stage, and you may end up not buying that property for that reason. So that's why I think, the message for me would be, take responsibility for your own finances. Make sure things are done. Check your profile all the time.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think I've said this in a previous interview with somebody else as well, that always remember that a trust is not a control. So don't just trust
Absolutely.
people, go and basically educate yourself about these things.
Absolutely, 100% agree.
Okay, Thinus, then I want to ask you the last question. I think we've discussed a lot of things now, but what would your advice be for consumers and the viewers out there? What can they do to ensure that they basically have a good credit score, and that they maintain a good credit score?
So I think first and foremost is pay your existing credit obligations. Stick to what you've agreed to with your bank or your retailer or your vehicle financier. Honor your agreements. Pay what you should pay, and pay it on time. If your bank statement or your credit card statement or your retail statement says payment is due on the 8th of January, for example, pay it on the 7th or the 8th of January. Don't pay it a day later. The moment you pay it a day later, it goes into a different cycle already. And in terms of the cycle with the bank, you're already then in default. So pay, and also then pay on time, and pay, the full amount. If you can't pay, my advice would then be, get in touch with your credit provider as soon as possible. That's the most important thing. Then secondly, I would say limit your credit exposure. I know that's difficult, and people are living, robbing Peter to pay Paul sometimes, and there's school fees that needs to be paid, and school clothes. But having too many accounts, or being exposed to too many accounts, will definitely affect your credit score. And if you, for example, get into a situation where you're applying for some sort of a payday or monthly loan every single month, that is reflected in your credit bureau score, and that will impact your score, for example. So limit your exposure to those sort of short-term lending items if you can. Yeah, I mean, if you get, I think lastly, if you get summonsed, or there's some sort of a legal dispute over an account, don't ignore it, because you don't want to end up having a judgment against you. There's a rule in legal terms where they can actually serve a summons just by putting it on your door, and you won't even know about it. So make sure that you are aware of what's happening from a legal perspective. And I think lastly is stay on top of your credit profile. Make sure you understand what's happening there. Make sure you are aware of whatever inquiries is made. And if there's a dispute on any of your accounts, deal with them swiftly and make sure that they are dealt with.
Okay. Yes, thank you. You have really given us so much information to just understand the topic better, to understand the impact of certain scenarios. But you're also some tips in terms of what consumers and the viewers can really do to just maintain a good credit score, especially during these times. So, Thinus, thanks so much for spending some time with us. And then to the viewers, I hope you have received a lot of value and that you understand this better and that you can go out and make more informed decisions in terms of incurring debts and how to manage your debt. And then I also want to encourage you, please go and obtain your credit reports. I am going to share Thinus's details, the website of Very Credit, so that you can go on there and get your credit report and score, but also remember, have a look at the other bureaus as well to also obtain your credit reports from them. So I hope you've enjoyed it. Remember to subscribe to the channel. Also click on the link to enter the book giveaway competition. And then I will see you again at the next Ronel Talks Money Show.